Today I'll show you how to paint a wild rose in watercolor. I've chosen to use mixed media paper for this tutorial. I'll explain why I love it, how I accidentally overworked the watercolor, and how easily I solved this watercolor problem. So grab yourself a coffee and let's go. So I always begin with a simple line drawing like this, and I will provide you with a free traceable line drawing and the reference photograph, and these will be in our Facebook group, details of which will be in the information box underneath this video. I'll put an information card on the top of your screen which shows you how I traced down my drawings, and the brushes that I'm using are spotter brushes from Rosemary & Co, but use what you have. All the materials that I will use in this video will be in the description box underneath this video tutorial. So that's enough of the intro, let's start painting. So I've added some water to my palette like this, and we're going to be mixing a watery mix of each of the colors to begin with, which means that we will be building up the colors really slowly. So I'm mixing a cool pink with a tiny bit of French grey together, and then French grey on its own like this. You'll need to add a lot of water to these because, as I said, you'll want them to be really watery at this point. And to begin with, I'm going to be working wet in wet, which means quite simply that I'll be adding water to the areas where I want to drop in the paint like this, working slowly, petal by petal. I'm only applying the water where I want the paint to be dropped, so be careful at this point that you don't put the water where you don't want the paint to go. So picking up the cool pink, I'm just dropping it in gently on each of the petals, looking closely at my reference photograph as I go through. I'm letting the paint settle very gently onto this paper, and then just moving it around with the tip of my brush just to make sure that the paint is put into the position that I want it to be. So just slowly working through petal by petal, using the brush to manipulate the paint, as I've said, and I'll continue this process for all of the petals on the flower head. I've used mixed media paper for a couple of reasons for this tutorial. First of all, I really love the way it makes light work of blending the paint, particularly so with the application method that I use. Also, I realized that not everyone has a stash of expensive watercolor paper within their kit, but it's a really good way of learning how to use watercolor without maybe using your good paper to practice on. But it really does give good results, and like I said, it makes the application blending process a little bit easier. So you can see me here using a yellow gold kind of color, which I'm going to mix with some water and a tiny bit of gray to add to the middle of the plant like this, working around the stamen to create a little bit of form and negative painting. Just really slowly using the tip of my number 2 size spotter to do this. These have lovely points, and I'm applying the paint in a similar way to kind of like using a felt tip pen, as if I'm colouring in. And these brushes allow you to do this because it lets you have full control of your paint application. So if you hit that subscribe button and the bell notification, you will be notified of upcoming tutorials which I release every Tuesday. So you can see me here just adding that grey tone and really gently pulling out what will eventually become some veins within the petals. Just using a soft touch to pull these veins into place, and continuing the process for all of the other petals like this, making sure, as always, I blend them in with a damp brush. And you can see how easily the paint merges together just by using the soft touch of the brush like this. So you can see me here mixing some green colours to add to begin the first washes for the leaves. I'm using a mixture of sap, olive green and a little bit of phthalo green, and I'll just mix and match these colours to make sure that each of the leaves has a different tone so that they stand out from each other. I'm not actually working really true to the photograph for this tutorial. I just want you to be able to see the paint application methods and how you can make these leaves pop out and stand out from the others. You'll notice that there's a really small water droplet on this leaf here, and I'm working around it like this with the paint, leaving it completely clear at the moment. We want to be working on this little area separately, so I'm just leaving it free from paint just now so that we can work on it a little bit later on. I'm just pulling the paint into the little serrated edges of the leaf, as you can see, once again dipping in and out of the green tones that I have on my palette. I'm adding a darker green to the bottom of the leaf here to give it just a little bit of definition and some tonal contrast. Once again, using the tip of my brush to pull into the serrations on the edge. I'm just patting the brush on the kitchen towel and using the damp brush to manipulate that paint where I want it to go. And the same process for the other leaves like this. Just very gently working around the outside, making sure that I work within the pencil line. And of course, this time I'm working wet on dry, which means that I'm applying the paint directly onto the watercolor paper, or in this case, mixed media paper, as I go along. So earlier on in this video, I mentioned that we have a Facebook group connected to this channel where you can access the line drawings and reference photograph that we have used for these tutorials, as well as being able to post up your finished paintings and have some feedback. We really are a lovely community there, so do consider joining us, and I will put the link in the description box underneath this video so that you can access all of the photographs and line drawings. So I'm just going to continue this process using the same application method for all of these leaves. You'll notice here that on this top leaf there is a tiny bit of bloom where the water has pushed the pigment into the paint. It really isn't a problem, and this is one of the reasons I love using mixed media paper, is because it's so easy to resolve any issues that you may have. Here you can see me using a flat synthetic brush to just wipe out some paint that I've accidentally gone outside the pencil line. So now I'm adding a little bit of the cool pink to the existing green mix that I have on my palette, just to darken up a little bit like this. I want the paint at this point to have a little bit of tonal variation, so we're going to go for the darker tone, adding a little bit of deep phthalo green. You may just want to add the dark green that you have within your palette. You don't have to use the colours that I'm using, just use what you have. And just use your eye to just see if you can make them as dark as you can get them. I try to stick to using a limited palette for these tutorials so that everybody can join in. I want art to be accessible for everybody, so we're kind of doing botanical art the easy way. So once again, I'm working around this little water droplet like this and applying another glaze of colour on top, just to give it a bit of tonal variation and contrast. Colour glazing in watercolour simply means that you're applying a layer of watercolour paint over an existing layer of paint, but these do have to be dry before you add them, otherwise the colours will bloom and just merge into each other, which is what you don't want. I'm using the tip of my brush here to sharpen up the area where the other leaf overlaps to give it a bit of definition. And you can see how I'm just working down the central vein like this. So I mentioned earlier on in this video that watercolour can have a bit of a bad press for being a hard medium to work with. Drop your watercolor queries in the description box below and let me know if you have a particular thing that you don't like about watercolor and how you solved it yourself. Right, so you can see me here just using the tip of my brush to use the darker green tone, and all I've done is I've outlined this little water droplet with the darker green like this. Just sharpening up that edge to make it really stand off the paper, to make it look like it really is a three-dimensional shape. And just using a tiny bit of the lighter green colour to work around the tiny little highlight in the middle, just paying attention to my reference photograph as you can see on the screen right now. I do suggest that you print out the reference photographs so that you have them to the side of your screen if you decide to paint along with me. So I'm just painting around the vein down the center of this leaf. Once again, just adding a little bit of a darker value to the leaves here. This is kind of a learn to paint as you go approach, which I really enjoy, and it's actually how I taught myself to paint. So it worked for me, and I'm hoping it's going to work for you also. I think there's a really good sense of achievement if you can paint a painting and learn as you go through and have something nice to show at the end of it, right? So you can see now I'm going back to this little water droplet, and I'm using the tip of my brush to blend in that darker colour. And I'm now mixing some more greens with the yellow-green tone and going over the adjoining leaf now that that initial wash has dried, adding this darker glaze and adding a bit more form and a little bit more definition here and there. I don't want the leaves on this painting to be too detailed. I just want them to have a kind of looser feel, but to make sure that you have those different tonal variations and color variations to make sure that they stand out from one another. And you can see how easy it is on this mixed media paper just to pull down the color into the existing wash like this. Now that the colour has dried on this leaf, I'm just adding a little bit of detail, just putting in some veins, working gently around this little water droplet. And as I'm going through, you can see me just sharpening up the serrated edges on the leaves like this. If you are enjoying this video, please give it a thumbs up. It's a way of letting YouTube know that you're enjoying my content, and it really does help to support me on this platform more than you know, so I really appreciate it. Okay, so back to the tutorial, and you can see I'm adding a little bit of detail to this bottom leaf here. Now it's quite clear from this tutorial, from this painting, that you can see how the colour has slightly bloomed on this leaf. I'm not too bothered by this. I quite like this looser look, but if it worries you, then do give it another glaze once it is dry. This mixed media paper is a really forgiving paper, and it helps the blending process. It really does make it easier for you. If I were to be working this on a, say, 100% cotton watercolor paper, the blending wouldn't be as easy, but this is really, really forgiving. And so if you are new to watercolor painting, maybe consider trying working on mixed media paper and see how you get on. Maybe it isn't for everybody, but honestly, I find this this paper really, really good for working on and blending these colors together. I'm mixing a yellow tone with a green tone, so we have the yellow colour and so it would be like a cadmium yellow and I suppose olivey green or even a green gold colour, but use what you have in your palette. We want this colour to be a sort of yellowy green mix, and I'm not too fussy as to what kind of colour it is, as long as it has that kind of hue around it. And you can see me adding a tiny bit of cool pink and just going around each and every one of the anther like this. One of our Facebook group members very kindly sent me a plant diagram so that I'm learning my learning my names of the parts of the plant. So I say with great shame, as a botanical artist, I don't know the names, so I can never remember the names of them. So thank you very much for sending me the information. I do appreciate it with great shame. Okay, so going back to the petals one by one, going back to the original mixes within my palette. So we have the cool pink with the grey and the grey on its own. And I'm just adding this, as you can see, once again, blending those colours together with a damp brush. Really building up those subtle colours within each petal. We want these colours to be really, really gentle and just have a little bit of shape and form, but not too bright. We want them to be very, very gentle. And I'm using the reference photograph just as a kind of guide for this one. I'm not going, as I said, I'm not going sort of exactly as it is, but we want it to look as if it has some shape and some form. But you just want to keep an eye on your reference photograph to see roughly where you're going with the colours. Like I said, botanical art made easy. Using a clean damp brush once again to blend those colours together. I ought to mention we also have a Patreon site where I post new ad-free content every month, as well as mini weekly videos. We have different tiers for you there, and in the full-length video tutorials I explain how to paint botanicals in a little more detail. And of course it's a great way for you to support my channel, so I'll put the link in the description box underneath this video if you'd like to take a look at our Patreon site. Okay, so as you can see, once again, now that we have this template wash in place, I'm continuing to build up the colours on the petals like this. Always blending in the colours as I go through. So you can see me here just adding a tiny drop of water to my palette, and the reason I do this rather than dip my brush into a jar at this point is it just gives you a little bit more control over the amount of water that you add to the paint. I tend to, if I dip my brush into a jar of water, I always have a little bit too much paint within the brush and it just makes it a little bit too difficult to blend. So a little tip, if you want to just add a tiny bit of water to your palette as I've done here, you can just pick up a tiny bit of water to just re-moisten the paints on your palette. Just using these three colours to just add some more tonal variation and some darker values to the petals like this. And you can see how I'm just utilising the paint within my palette to enhance some of the details like this, working in between some of the filaments on the stamen to just make them pop out and give them a little bit of a negative shape like this. We'll still need to be building on these colours a little bit later on, and this is just our kind of template wash that we use in order to have a better idea of where we're going a little bit later. Once again, just pulling up those lines to create some shapes and some veins. Like I said, we're going to build on them later. There's a tiny little fold here within the petal, and I'm just adding some of the grey tone to enhance that, to make it look as if it's got some shape and some form. And once again, just blending it in and pulling up these veins as before. And you can see by wiggling the brush, it's very, very easy to do. So now that everything's dry, I'm using this number 2 sized, this is a red dot synthetic spotter from Rosemary & Co. Use whatever brush you have, but I absolutely adore these brushes. They last for quite a while, and they just make the application process easier. So all I'm doing here is adding some plain water glaze over the petals to just blend those colours together on this beautiful mixed media paper and letting it dry. Now, you heard me say at the beginning of this video that I'd overworked the paint, so I felt that I should show you and share with you my error. I've lifted out the water droplet because I felt it was looking a little bit too muddy, and I just applied some water and some kitchen towel to lift off that paint. So when the paper had dried completely, you can see me just reapplying the initial paint that we used to paint around that water droplet to just make it a little bit sharper. I felt that it was looking too messy, so just by adding that water on top of it, lifting it out with a kitchen towel, I was able to rescue my painting and get back on with the job in hand. So you can see here now that everything's dry, and we can start to think about adding some more shape and some form, now that I've sorted out my error. So I'm mixing a mixture of the olive green, yellow green and sap like this to create some separate puddles, and I'm not too fussy, as I said before, on the exact colour, but we just want the colour to be different for each leaf. Adding once more some cool pink to the mix to give it that darker value. I'm also adding another bit of deep phthalo green, as you can see, and I'm just swatching out my colours like this. It's always a good idea to have a piece of scrap paper when you're painting, just to see how your colour will look when you apply it onto the paper. And another error I felt I should point out to you is where this leaf at the top here adjoins another leaf. I forgot that there was actually a gap between them, so I'm using my flat brush here to lift out the paint in the same way that I lifted out the water droplet, by just using a damp brush and wiggling it into the area I want to remove, and very, very simply patting it dry with a kitchen towel like this and letting it dry completely before I reapply the paint. This is a really simple way to sort out any errors, and this works particularly well on this beautiful mixed media paper. That paint has now dried, where we had lifted out the paper has to be completely dry, and then just going back over with a mix of the green as before. There may be a residual amount of that green colour underneath, but it really doesn't matter, and I think I've got away with it. Let me know what you think in the comments below. If I've made a royal mess of this painting, then do let me know. So you can see me here just using the tip of my brush, dipping in between the green paints as before to just outline the leaf to give it some definition against those really pale petals. At this stage of the painting, with our leaves particularly, it's just a case of going over the areas we've painted. We've taken the guesswork out now by putting our glazes on, so it's just a case of building up those colours and adjusting them as we go through. I think it's a really good idea to have a sharp edge where the petals overlap the leaves. So I use the tip of my brush here to just outline and give some sharpness where they meet. I think this looks really bold and really strong, and it really makes the delicacy of the flower stand out. And I'm just adding a few details here and there to this leaf. I don't want this to be too detailed, but at least you can see that there are a few elements of the veins put in, as you can see here. And just sharpening up one or two of the edges using the tip of my brush. The brush I'm using at this point, I think it's a number 2 size spotter. You could use a 0 or a 2, something with a really fine point works really well at this stage. When you're doing your larger glazes at the beginning, when you're working wet in wet, a larger size brush works, I think for me, slightly better, because it means that you have a larger surface area. But when you're working smaller, then obviously go for a smaller size brush. I'm mixing some yellow and a little bit of green yellow here to make a kind of yellowy green tone and adding a tiny bit of sap. I quite like the idea of having a yellow tone at the top of some of these leaves, or even at the base, and adding some of the deep phthalo green underneath, so that you have that beautiful change in hue where you go from the yellow to the green to the kind of almost magical blue tone. And like I said, it maybe isn't a true botanical painting, but botanicals made easy, and also it gives you an element to perhaps experiment a little bit with your paint application, and of course your color glazing, which makes this fun to learn. And hopefully 3, 2, 1. So just add some of the other color greens that you have within your mix to give it a little bit of variation without it looking like a flat green, which is what we don't want. Once again, using the tip of my brush to wiggle into those little serrated edges. I'm doing the same thing to the other leaves, as you can see, and I'm patting my brush on some kitchen towel just to take the excess paint off, because I don't want it to flood the paper. It's important that your paint is relatively not too wet at this stage, because you want to be able to manipulate that paint wherever you want it to go. So having it too wet means that you lose control. So once again, just sharpening up those edges to make that paint stand out from the paper like this, and just enhancing a few of the details on the leaves. We've still got a way to go on this painting, and we need to focus on our attention on the center of this beautiful wild rose in a little while. But first of all, let's get some of this detail in and outlining some of the leaves, some of the veins on the leaves that I've applied earlier on, just to sharpen up those shapes as before. So you'll notice that I've added a little bit of colour to the stamen and anther at the middle here. To do this, I've just mixed a simple mix of the yellow colour and yellow with a little bit of the cool pink and applied it as the second wash. When this is dry, I'm now mixing a slightly thicker mix, and you want this paint to be quite dry on your palette to give it full control. And all I'm doing here is just adding a little bit more detail to each of the anther like this. Where the anther hits the filament, you'll want to just give it a little bit of definition to create a sort of arrow type shape on some of the elements as I've done here. This really makes them stand out and gives them proper definition and some form, just like I'm doing on the one on the right hand side. You don't want these to look flat, you need them to look as natural as you can by giving them some shade like this and a little bit of extra colour to go through. So just mix and match your colours that you have on your palette here, so the yellow tone and the orangey tone like this to just add some contrast. You'll also notice that I've added some of the green colour in between the filaments to negatively paint around them to give them some shape, and I will be defining these a little later on. So as you can see here, I've got the green mix on my brush, and yet again the mixture on my palette is quite dry, and just adding a tiny bit of water to it so that it's movable enough to add to enhance these filaments. So at this stage of the painting, it really is a case of building up the layers that you've already applied and adding your tonal variations and some sharpness and some definition, as you can see me doing here. So at this point in the painting, it's just a case of going over the elements that you've already got in place. So I'm going to stop talking because I think I've talked enough, and I'll let you watch the rest of this tutorial with just some music. So I'll let you carry on watching.